Power in the underworld isn't just about the gun resting in your holster. It's about knowing exactly who is breathing the same air as you. Domenico Costa thought he held all the cards when he mocked a clumsy waitress in his native tongue. He never expected a ghost to answer. The air inside Trattoria di Santino was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, white truffles, and old money. Tucked away in the affluent heart of Boston's North End, the restaurant was a front, a spectacularly successful one, but a front nonetheless. It was the neutral ground where the city's elite rubbed elbows with the men who controlled the ports, the unions, and the streets. Camilla Hayes adjusted the crisp white apron around her waist, her fingers trembling just enough to betray the 3 cups of black coffee she had consumed since 5 a.m. She was exhausted. Her life for the past 3 years had been an endless cycle of keeping her head down, serving plates of overpriced veal, and ensuring her meager cash tips were hidden under the loose floorboard of her South Boston apartment. She was ordinary, invisible, exactly as she needed to be. Tonight, however, the restaurant thrummed with a heavy, suffocating tension. The VIP section, a secluded alcove draped in heavy velvet curtains, had been booked under a dummy corporation. But every staff member knew who was sitting at the mahogany table. Domenico Costa. At 32, Domenico was the undisputed head of the Costa Syndicate, having taken the reins after his father's suspicious heart attack 3 years prior. He was a man of sharp angles and cold obsidian eyes, dressed in a tailored charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than Camilla's annual rent. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His silence was far more terrifying than any outburst. Sitting beside him were his 2 most trusted lieutenants, Matteo Falco, a hulking enforcer with a scarred jawline, and Leo Romero, the syndicate's financial architect. Camilla stood near the service station, holding a tray with a freshly uncorked bottle of 2010 Barolo. Her manager, a perpetually sweating man named Robert Paul, shoved her shoulder. "Get in there, Camilla. Pour the wine. Do not speak. Do not make eye contact." "Just pour and get out," Robert hissed, his forehead gleaming under the dim chandelier. "Why me?" Camilla whispered back, her grip tightening on the corkscrew. "Send Maria. She usually does the VIPs." Maria called in sick because she knew Costa was coming. Robert shot back. "Go. Now. Before they think we're disrespecting them." Swallowing the lump of anxiety in her throat, Camilla balanced the silver tray and approached the alcove. As she slipped past the heavy curtains, the ambient noise of the restaurant vanished, replaced by the low, dangerous hum of men discussing things that sent people to early graves. "I don't care what Judge Corrin said," Domenico was saying, his voice a smooth, gravelly baritone that commanded the space. "He took our money for the re-election campaign. He owes us the harbor zoning permits. If he wants to play hardball, remind him about the photographs from his trip to Atlantic City." Matteo chuckled, a low, grating sound. "Consider it done, boss. And what about the Irish? Callahan's boys have been sniffing around the Southie warehouses." "Let them sniff," Domenico replied, leaning back in his leather chair. He steepled his fingers, the gold signet ring on his right hand catching the dim light. "When they find what we left them, they'll reconsider their expansion." Camilla kept her eyes glued to the white tablecloth. She stepped up to Matteo's right side to begin pouring the wine. "Just pour, nod, and leave," she chanted in her mind. But as she tipped the heavy glass bottle, Matteo suddenly shoved his chair back to reach for a dossier on the table. His elbow collided violently with Camilla's hip. The heavy bottle of Barolo jerked. A splash of the dark crimson wine leapt from the neck of the bottle, landing squarely on the pristine white cuff of Matteo's custom dress shirt, leaving a stain that looked disturbingly like fresh blood. The silence that descended upon the table was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a car crash. Camilla froze, the bottle suspended in her hand. Her breath hitched in her throat. Matteo slowly turned his massive head, his dark eyes locking onto Camilla with a mixture of disbelief and raw fury. "You stupid little—" Domenico raised a single hand, silencing his enforcer instantly. He slowly turned his gaze toward Camilla. His eyes swept over her cheap black uniform, her messy auburn bun, and her pale, terrified face. He saw exactly what he expected to see. A dime a dozen American waitress, completely out of her depth, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. A cruel, dismissive smirk tugged at the corner of Domenico's mouth. He leaned slightly toward Matteo and spoke in a rapid, guttural dialect of Sicilian, a specific, harsh tongue born in the back streets of Palermo, designed to be incomprehensible to outsiders. Talia acquista, Domenico sneered, his tone dripping with utter contempt. Navacababba chi non sapi manco unni metti pedi. Cacciala fora prima chi ci scipu a testa e a fazzu spariri. Look at this clumsy cow. Doesn't even know where she puts her feet. Get her out of my sight before I rip her head off and make her disappear. Leo Romero snickered, picking up his water glass. Matteo's posture relaxed slightly, amused by his boss's casual brutality. They waited for the ignorant American girl to apologize blindly, completely unaware of the threat against her life. Camilla stood perfectly still. The terrified trembling in her fingers suddenly stopped. Something inside her, something she had spent 3 long, agonizing years burying under mountains of fake smiles and submissions, snapped. It was the pride of her bloodline, a bloodline that did not cower before men like Domenico Costa. Before her brain could remind her of the danger, her mouth opened. She didn't just speak. She let her posture shift, her spine straightening from the subservient slouch of a waitress into the regal bearing of a born aristocrat. She looked Domenico dead in the eyes, her gaze suddenly matching his in its icy intensity. When she spoke, her voice was calm, low, and laced with a flawless, high-born, Palermitan accent that cut through the silence like a straight razor. "O vino si può accattare di nuovo, signori," Camilla said, the words rolling off her tongue with dangerous grace. "Ma a mancanza di creanza è una macchia che non si lava. L'ha voluto iddu o vino sopra a camisa. Ma viti a scusare, ma si volete o rispetto, a comenza a portarilu. The wine can easily be bought again, sir, but a lack of manners is a stain that doesn't wash out." He knocked the wine onto his own shirt. "Excuse me, but if you want respect, start by showing it." The temperature in the alcove plummeted to absolute zero. Matteo's jaw dropped. Leo nearly choked on his water. But Domenico froze entirely. The cruel smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzed shock. He stared at her, his obsidian eyes widening slightly. It wasn't just that she had understood him. It wasn't just that she had spoken back. It was the way she spoke. Her cadence, her specific pronunciation of the vowels, the archaic formality of her phrasing it, was an ultra-specific, localized dialect of the Palermitan elite. It was a dialect that belonged strictly to the old blood families of Sicily, families that didn't work in cheap American restaurants. For a span of 5 seconds, nobody breathed. Domenico looked at the girl, really looked at her for the first time. He noticed the high aristocratic sweep of her cheekbones, the fierce, unyielding pride in her green eyes, and the way she stood her ground against 3 fully armed men without a flinch. Camilla suddenly realized what she had just done. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving behind a cold, rushing terror. She had broken the #1 rule of her survival: never be noticed. Without waiting for a response, Camilla slammed the bottle of Barolo down onto the table with a sharp thud. She turned on her heel, pushed past the heavy velvet curtains, and practically ran toward the kitchen. "Fermala, stop her," Domenico whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. Matteo leaped up from his chair, but Domenico grabbed his arm with a grip like a vice. "Not you," Domenico commanded, his eyes still glued to the spot where Camilla had just been standing. "Don't make a scene. Get Robert." The back alley, behind Trattoria di Santino, smelled of decaying cabbage and rain. Camilla didn't care. She stripped off her apron as she sprinted down the fire escape stairs, tossing the white cloth into a rusted dumpster. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Stupid! Stupid! Stupid!" she screamed at herself internally. 3 years of hiding, 3 years of scrubbed identities, fake social security cards, and living like a rat in the shadows, all undone in 5 seconds of wounded pride. Domenico Costa wasn't just a mobster. He was deeply connected to the Sicilian underworld. He would know exactly what that dialect meant. He would know she wasn't Camilla Hayes from Ohio. She hit the wet pavement of the alley and ran. She didn't wait for her final paycheck. She didn't say goodbye to Maria or Robert. She hailed a passing taxi on Hanover Street, shoved a crumpled $20 bill at the driver, and told him to drive toward South Boston. Back inside the restaurant, the VIP alcove was practically vibrating with tension. Robert Paul stood before Domenico Costa, sweating so profusely it looked as though he had just stepped out of a shower. I swear to you, Mr. Costa, I didn't know," Robert stammered, wringing his hands. "She's just a girl. Camilla Hayes. Been here 6 months." "Camilla Hayes," Domenico repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It tasted like ash. It was a fake. He knew it in his bones. "Where is she from?" Her file says Columbus, Ohio," Robert replied, his voice cracking. "I can pull her employment records, her address, anything you need, I swear. Just please don't hurt my business." Domenico ignored the groveling. He turned to Leo. "Digits. I want everything. I want her address, her bank records, her phone logs, and the damn street camera footage of her leaving this building. And I want it 10 minutes ago." Leo nodded rapidly, already pulling out an encrypted tablet. "On it, boss." Domenico leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The dialect. It was a ghost echoing in his ears. It was the dialect of the Lobianco family. 10 years ago, the Lobianco syndicate had controlled half of Palermo. They were royalty. But power breeds envy, and a coalition of rival families, including Domenico's own uncle, had orchestrated the infamous Feast of Street John massacre. The entire Lobianco bloodline was supposed to have been wiped out in a single night of fire and lead. But rumors had always persisted that the Don's youngest daughter, Isabella, had been smuggled out before the estate was burned to the ground. Domenico rubbed his jaw, a dark, dangerous obsession blooming in his chest. A waitress in Boston, speaking the dead language of a slaughtered empire. If she was a Lobianco, she was the last heir to a fortune in hidden offshore accounts and a blood vendetta that could tear the East Coast apart. If his enemies found her, they would use her. If the Sicilians found her, they would kill her. "Boss," Leo said, interrupting Domenico's thoughts. "I hacked the payroll system. Got an address. It's a shithole apartment in Southie, 442 Mercer Street, Unit 3B. But what?" Domenico snapped. "Her social security number. I just ran it through the backdoor federal database. It was issued 3 years ago to a deceased infant in Texas. Camilla Hayes is a ghost. A very, very expensive, professionally crafted ghost." Domenico stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Get the car." "We taking the boys?" Matteo asked, cracking his knuckles. "No," Domenico said softly. "Just me. You two stay here and clean up this mess. I don't want anyone else knowing what happened tonight. If anyone asks, the waitress got fired for spilling wine. Understood?" "Yes, boss." Across the city, Camilla burst into her cramped, dimly lit apartment. She locked the deadbolt, threw the chain, and jammed a wooden chair under the doorknob. It was a pathetic defense against men who carried C4, but it made her feel marginally better. She didn't turn on the lights. Moving entirely by the glow of the street lamps filtering through the blinds, she dragged a worn canvas duffel bag from under her mattress. She had drilled for this. She knew the protocol. From the closet, she pulled out a stack of vacuum-sealed cash, about $30,000 she had managed to siphon from her emergency funds before going entirely off the grid. She threw in 2 sets of dark clothing, a burner phone, and a fake Canadian passport under the name Sarah Jenkins. Then, she knelt by the loose floorboard near the radiator. She pried it up with a kitchen knife and pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined mahogany box. Camilla opened it. Inside rested a vintage, silver-plated Beretta 92 FS. It had belonged to her father, Don Vincenzo Lobianco. Beside the gun was a faded Polaroid of her as a child, sitting on her father's lap in the gardens of their Palermo estate. She traced her father's face with a trembling finger. "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered. "I let my temper slip, just like you always said I would." She checked the magazine of the Beretta. Fully loaded. She racked the slide, chambering around with a sharp metallic clack that sounded deafening in the quiet apartment. She shoved the gun into the waistband of her jeans, pulling her dark hoodie over it. She zipped up the duffel bag and slung it over her shoulder. She needed to get to South Station. If she could catch the midnight Amtrak to Montreal, she might just disappear again before Costa's hackers untangled her web. Camilla walked toward the door, reaching for the wooden chair wedged under the knob. Suddenly, she stopped. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The air in the apartment seemed to thicken, growing heavy and still. Scritch. Click. It was a sound so faint she almost missed it. The sound of a lockpick sliding into her deadbolt. Camilla backed away from the door slowly, her hand dropping to the cold grip of the Beretta at her waist. She moved silently toward the fire escape window, but as she glanced through the blinds, she saw a sleek black Mercedes parked in the alley below. A massive man in a suit, not Mateo. Someone else was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. Her exit was blocked. Click. Thunk. The deadbolt disengaged. The chain rattled as the door pushed inward, straining against the wooden chair. Camilla, a deep, velvet voice echoed from the hallway. It was Domenico. He didn't sound angry. He sounded fascinated. Or should I call you Isabella? Camilla's blood turned to ice. He knew. In less than an hour, he had connected the dots. "Don't come in here," Camilla yelled, pulling the Beretta and aiming it squarely at the door. Her hands were no longer shaking. The terrified waitress was gone. The daughter of a mafia king had taken her place. "I will blow your head off, Costa." A low chuckle drifted through the gap in the door. "You have a good stance. I can tell by your voice. But we both know that chair isn't going to stop me. I'm coming in. Keep the gun pointed at my chest if it makes you feel safe." Before she could brace herself, a violent kick shattered the doorframe. The wooden chair snapped like a twig, sending splinters flying across the linoleum floor. The door swung open, and Domenico Costa stepped into the apartment. He brushed a splinter off the lapel of his Brioni suit, completely unfazed by the silver barrel of the Beretta, pointed directly at his heart. He closed the broken door behind him, as best as he could, plunging the room back into semi-darkness. He looked at her, his eyes tracing the line of her gun, the duffel bag on her shoulder, and the fierce, cornered animal look in her green eyes. "Isabella Lobianco," Domenico murmured, his voice laced with an emotion Camilla couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't hatred. It was reverence. The lost princess of Palermo, hiding in a cheap apron serving veal. "The world has been looking for you for a decade." "The world wants me dead," Camilla spat, keeping her finger on the trigger. "Take one more step, Domenico, and I'll add you to the list of men who underestimated me." Domenico didn't step forward. Instead, he slowly raised his hands, palms open, showing he was unarmed. "I didn't come here to kill you, Isabella," he said softly. "I came here because, if I found you in an hour, the men who actually want you dead will find you by tomorrow morning." He locked his obsidian eyes with hers, the air crackling with dangerous electricity. "I came here to make you a deal." The silver barrel of the Beretta did not waver. Isabella Lobianco's hands were as steady as carved marble, even as her heart threatened to hammer its way out of her chest. "A deal," she repeated, the word dripping with venom. "Acosta breaks into my home in the dead of night to offer me a deal. Forgive me if I don't put the kettle on. Your family slaughtered mine. Why shouldn't I put a bullet between your eyes right now and take my chances with the rest?" Domenico stood perfectly still in the dim light of the South Boston apartment. He made no sudden moves, keeping his hands visible. The ambient glow from the street lamp illuminated the sharp, patrician lines of his face. "Because my name is Domenico, not Silvio," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble that contrasted violently with the tension in the room. "It was my uncle, Silvio Costa, who orchestrated the Feast of Street John massacre. He used the Corleonesi remnants and the Greco clan to burn your estate to the ground. He took the old country, and he left me the scraps here in Boston. You hate him for murdering your father. I hate him for poisoning my grandfather and stealing my birthright. Isabella narrowed her eyes. The beretta remained raised. Family politics. How tragic for you. Move aside, Domenico. I have a train to catch. You won't make it to South Station, Domenico replied, his gaze drifting to the canvas duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Leo already pinged the facial recognition cameras at Logan Airport and the train terminals. If my men can do it, so can the Sicilians. Do you really think Silvio stopped looking for the lost Lo Bianco heir? Your face is a liability, Isabella. You speak like a ghost, you walk like a queen, and your DNA is the key to the Bank Pictet and Saye accounts in Geneva. 300 million euros in uncut diamonds and liquid assets, locked behind a biometric vault that only a direct descendant of Vincenzo Lo Bianco can open. Isabella's breath hitched, just a fraction, but Domenico noticed. Silvio needs you alive just long enough to open that vault, Domenico continued, taking a slow, calculated half-step forward. Then he will put a bullet in your head and dump you in the Mediterranean. You've been hiding for 3 years, scraping by on Waitress tips, jumping at shadows. I am offering you a way to stop running. And what is the price of this miracle? She asked, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. Marriage, Domenico said bluntly. The word hung in the stale air of the apartment, heavy and absurd. Isabella let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. You're insane. I am a pragmatist, he countered smoothly. The old families back in Palermo are traditionalists. They respect bloodlines. Right now, Silvio rules through fear, but he is a usurper. If I return to Sicily, with Don Vincenzo's only surviving daughter as my wife, the fractured syndicates will rally behind us. You legitimize my claim to the throne. In exchange, I give you the full protection of the Boston Syndicate, access to your family's fortune, and most importantly, Domenico paused, his eyes gleaming with a dark, predatory light. I will give you Silvio Costa. I will let you hold the knife. Isabella stared at him. The sheer audacity of the proposal was staggering. She looked into the eyes of the man whose bloodline had cursed hers, searching for deception. She found only a cold, burning ambition that mirrored the hollow, aching vengeance inside her own soul. Before she could form a reply, a sharp, metallic ping echoed from the alleyway, followed instantly by the sound of shattering glass. Down, Domenico roared. He lunged forward, not to attack her, but to tackle her to the floor. The beretta discharged as Isabella fell, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly into the ceiling plaster. A split second later, a hail of suppressed automatic gunfire tore through the apartment's thin drywall and shattered the blinds. Feathers from her cheap pillows exploded into the air as bullets shredded the mattress where she had been sitting just minutes ago. Who is that? Isabella shouted over the deafening roar of splintering wood, covering her head as Domenico pressed her down against the linoleum. Not my men, Domenico yelled back, pulling a heavy, matte black Glock 19 from his shoulder holster. Silvio's hounds. They must have picked up the federal database ping when Leo ran your fake social security number. I told you. You wouldn't make it to the train. Footsteps thundered heavily in the hallway. They weren't sneaking anymore. The heavy footfalls belonged to professional hitters, men wearing tactical boots and carrying enough firepower to level the building. We need to move, Domenico ordered, grabbing her duffel bag with one hand and hauling her to her feet with the other. Fire escape. Now. Isabella didn't argue. The waitress Camilla was gone. The survivor, Isabella, took over. She scrambled toward the kitchen window, her grip tightening on her father's beretta. Domenico kicked the remaining glass out of the window frame and shoved her through onto the rusted iron grating of the fire escape. The cold Boston night air bit at her face. Rain had begun to fall, slicking the metal stairs. Move down. Stay low, Domenico commanded, covering her from the window. As Isabella descended the first flight, the apartment door was kicked entirely off its hinges. 2 men in dark tactical gear poured into the living room. Domenico didn't hesitate. He fired 3 rapid, deafening shots. The first man dropped instantly, a hollow-point round taking him in the throat. The second man dove for cover behind the shredded sofa, returning fire. Domenico ducked through the window, sliding down the wet iron ladder right behind Isabella. Bullets sparked against the metal railing inches from their heads, screeching into the brick alleyway. "Rocco!" Domenico barked into a small radio, clipped to his lapel. "Bring the car around. Front of the alley, hot extraction." "Copy that, boss," a gravelly voice crackled back. They reached the alley floor. The stench of wet garbage was entirely overpowered by the acrid smell of cordite. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind the rusted dumpster, raising a submachine gun directly at Domenico's back. Isabella didn't think. The grueling muscle memory instilled by her father's private security instructors a decade ago snapped into place. She raised the Beretta, aligned the sights with both eyes open, and pulled the trigger twice. Crack! Crack! The hitman crumpled to the wet asphalt before he could squeeze off a single round. 2 perfect holes punched through his chest armor. Domenico whipped around, his Glock raised, only to see the man dead at Isabella's feet. He looked at the smoking barrel of her gun, then up to her face. She was breathing heavily, the rain plastering her auburn hair to her cheeks, but her green eyes were utterly merciless. "Nice grouping," Domenico murmured, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his features. Tires squealed furiously at the mouth of the alley. A black, heavily armored Mercedes S-Class drifted around the corner, its high beams cutting blindly through the rain. The rear doors flew open. "Get in." Domenico shoved her toward the car, firing a suppression burst up at the fire escape, where another shooter had just appeared. Isabella dove onto the rich leather seats, Domenico piling in right behind her. "Drive!" he roared at Rocco. The heavy sedan fish-tailed on the wet pavement, the engine roaring as it tore out onto Mercer Street, leaving the burning apartment and the dead men far behind. For 10 minutes, the car interior was perfectly silent, save for the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the harsh, adrenaline-fueled breathing of its occupants. Isabella remained huddled against the passenger door, the Beretta still gripped tightly in her lap. Domenico holstered his weapon and pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, pressing it to a shallow, bleeding graze on his left cheekbone, where a fragment of brick had caught him. He watched her in the rearview mirror's dim light. "You saved my life back there," Domenico stated quietly. "I saved my own life," Isabella corrected, her voice trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "You just happened to be standing in the way." A faint, dangerous smile touched Domenico's lips. He reached into a hidden compartment in the armrest, pulling out a crystal decanter of scotch and 2 heavy tumblers. He poured them each a measure, handing one to her. "Drink. It helps with the shakes," he said. Isabella took the glass, knocking the amber liquid back in a single, burning swallow. The fiery warmth spread through her chest, grounding her. "Where are we going?" she asked, staring out at the blurred city lights. "My estate in Brookline," Domenico replied, pouring himself a drink. "It's a fortress, 3 acres, heavily wooded, 30 armed guards on rotation, and entirely off the grid. Silvio's men won't get within a mile of the gates without being turned into Swiss cheese." "And then what?" Isabella turned her head, fixing him with a piercing stare. "What happens when we get behind your impenetrable walls, Domenico? Am I a guest or a prisoner?" Domenico leaned back into the leather, swirling the scotch in his glass. "That depends entirely on you, Isabella. If you refuse my offer, you are a liability. I will give you a new passport, $100,000 in cash, and put you on a private jet to anywhere in the world. But we both know Silvio's reach. You will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder until they inevitably catch you." He leaned closer, the scent of expensive cologne, rain, and gunpowder washing over her. "But if you say yes," Domenico continued softly, "you walk through those doors not as a prisoner, but as the future queen of the Costa Syndicate. We forge an alliance. We take the flight to Geneva, we empty the Pictet and Salle vaults, and we buy enough firepower to march into Palermo and burn Silvio's empire to the ground." Isabella looked down at the empty glass in her hands. The life of Camilla Hayes was dead, buried under the rubble of a South Boston apartment. She could never go back to pouring wine and hiding her accent. The blood of Don Vincenzo Lobianco demanded more than survival. It demanded a reckoning. She looked up, meeting Domenico's dark, calculating gaze. She saw the danger in him, the ruthlessness that made him a king in the underworld. But she also saw a weapon she could wield. "I have conditions," Isabella said, her voice turning to ice. Domenico's smile widened. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. "I would expect nothing less from a Lobianco. Name them. We share power equally. I am not a trophy wife to be paraded around and kept in the dark. I sit in on the meetings. I review the ledgers. And when we finally corner Silvio Costa," her grip on the empty tumbler tightened until her knuckles turned white, "I am the one who pulls the trigger." Domenico raised his glass to her in a silent toast. Agreed. As the heavy iron gates of the Brookline estate loomed out of the darkness ahead, parting to let the armored Mercedes inside, Isabella realized she had just sold her soul to the devil. But as she watched the heavily armed guards fan out around the perimeter, she knew one thing for certain. She was finally done hiding. The subterranean air inside the private vaults of Banque Pictet and CA in Geneva was sterile, smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. Isabella stood before the massive, titanium-reinforced door of Vault 714, her hand resting lightly on the biometric scanner. Beside her, Domenico Costa watched in silence, his presence a dark, anchoring weight in the immaculate Swiss facility. 6 weeks had passed since the blood-soaked escape in Boston. 6 weeks of forged documents, private jets, and a wedding ceremony officiated in a dimly lit Brookline chapel with only armed guards as witnesses. Their marriage was a contract signed in gunpowder and ambition, yet in the quiet moments between the chaos, a dangerous, undeniable gravity had pulled them together. Domenico wasn't just a shield, he was a mirror, reflecting the same ruthless drive that burned within her. "Mademoiselle Lobianco," murmured Monsieur Laurent, the senior vault manager, his eyes averted in professional deference. "The genetic sequence is confirmed. The vault is yours." The heavy steel door hissed, unsealing with a deep pneumatic thud before swinging open. Inside, the legacy of Don Vincenzo Lobianco awaited. Stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds lined the left wall. In the center, resting on a velvet-lined pedestal, sat 3 leather briefcases. Isabella stepped forward and snapped the latches open. The brilliant, fractured light of hundreds of uncut, conflict-free diamonds spilled into the room. 300 million euros in liquid, untraceable assets. Isabella traced the edge of a massive stone, her green eyes reflecting the icy light. She looked back at Domenico. He wasn't looking at the diamonds. He was looking at her. "With this," Isabella said, her voice echoing in the concrete chamber, "we don't just buy an army, we buy Palermo." Domenico stepped into the vault, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his thumb gently grazing the line of her jaw, a rare gesture of intimacy that sent a jolt of electricity down her spine. "Silvio won't see us coming," he promised, his voice a low rumble. "We leave for Sicily tonight." 7 months later, the coastal wind howling off the Tyrrhenian Sea carried the scent of salt and impending death. Silvio Costa's compound, a sprawling, fortified villa perched on the cliffs of Mondello, was supposedly impenetrable. But impenetrable walls mean nothing when the guards manning them have been bought off with Lobianco diamonds. The assault began exactly at 2 a.m. There were no alarms. There was no chaotic shootout at the front gates. It was a surgical, terrifyingly quiet dismantling of Silvio's empire. Domenico and Isabella led a strike team of 20 elite, highly paid, ex-military contractors. Wearing black tactical gear and carrying suppressed carbines, they moved through the opulent courtyards like shadows. Isabella's heart hammered a steady, relentless rhythm. This was the culmination of a decade of nightmares. The little girl who had fled a burning estate was walking back into the fire as a queen. They breached the main house through the conservatory, leaving a trail of neutralized loyalists in their wake. Domenico moved with lethal precision, his Glock clearing corners with a fluid, terrifying grace. He was a force of nature, but he always kept himself positioned slightly ahead of Isabella, shielding her blind spots. It was an unspoken testament to the bond forged between them, a dark, unyielding devotion. They reached the heavy oak doors of Silvio's private study. Domenico caught Isabella's eye, giving her a single, affirming nod. He kicked the doors open. Silvio Costa sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber rum frozen halfway to his lips. He was an older, decayed reflection of Domenico, his face lined with years of paranoia and vicious power struggles. Two heavily armed bodyguards stood flanking him, but before they could raise their weapons, Domenico and two contractors dropped them with 3 synchronized, suppressed shots to the head. The bodies hit the Persian rug with a heavy thud. Silvio dropped his glass. It shattered, the rum pooling like blood. He stared at Domenico, his face draining of color. "Domenico," Silvio rasped, his voice trembling. "You bring mercenaries into my home? You betray your own blood?" "You poisoned my grandfather, Silvio," Domenico replied coldly, lowering his weapon and stepping aside. "You forfeited the right to speak of blood a long time ago, but I am not the one you need to answer to tonight." Isabella stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. She pulled the black tactical mask from her face, letting her auburn hair fall loose over her shoulders. She unholstered her father's silver-plated Beretta 92 FS, the metal gleaming in the dim light of the study. Silvio's eyes locked onto her face. Confusion morphed into recognition, and then into pure, unadulterated terror. He pushed himself back in his chair, his breathing ragged. "No," Silvio whispered, shaking his head. "No, you burned. You all burned at the estate. I phantasmi non bruciano, Silvio. Ghosts do not burn, Silvio," Isabella said. The flawless, aristocratic Palermitan dialect hung in the air, a chilling echo from the past. "I fantasmi tornano solo per ricogliere I debiti." Ghosts only return to collect their debts. "Wait, wait," Silvio pleaded, raising his hands, his previous bravado entirely gone. "I have offshore accounts. I have the Port Authority. I can give you everything. Domenico, listen to me. She will destroy our family." Domenico leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He looked entirely at ease. "She is my family now, uncle, and a deal is a deal." Isabella stepped closer to the desk, her expression an impenetrable mask of cold fury. The weight of her father, her mother, and the entire Lobianco lineage rested heavily on her finger. "This is for the Feast of St. John," Isabella stated quietly. Without hesitation, she pulled the trigger. The deafening crack of the Beretta shattered the silence of the villa. Silvio Costa slumped backward in his leather chair, a single, perfect hole between his eyes. The usurper was dead. Isabella stood frozen for a moment, the smoking gun in her hand. The suffocating weight she had carried for 10 years suddenly vanished, replaced by a fierce, soaring clarity. Domenico walked up beside her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he reached out and took her free hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was a silent vow of partnership, a physical anchor in the aftermath of her vengeance. "It's done," Domenico murmured, looking down at the body, then up to his wife. "The syndicates are united. The throne is ours." Isabella looked at the man who had torn her from the shadows and given her the world. She squeezed his hand, a genuine, dangerous smile finally breaking across her face. "Then let's go introduce ourselves to our new subjects," she said. Together, the new king and queen of the Sicilian underworld turned their backs on the dead man and walked out into the storm, ready to rule an empire forged in fire and diamonds. The underworld is a chessboard built entirely on blood and memory. Domenico Costa sought a clumsy waitress to punish, but instead he uncovered a lost queen to crown. Together, Isabella and Domenico rebuilt a fractured empire from the ashes of a spilled Barolo. They ruled not through fear alone, but through an unbreakable, forged alliance. A single mistake in Boston birthed the most terrifying syndicate Sicily had ever seen.